Connect MKE is sponsored by U.S. Bank. Winter officially begins December 21st, but it's already feeling like the dead of winter with bitterly cold temperatures and a lot of snow. What's causing this change from our normal early winter weather? We can attribute part of it to an early appearance of the Polar Vortex, a cold batch of air that's dropped into Wisconsin months ahead of its typical arrival. Helping us understand why this is happening and what it means is Dr. Andrea Lopez Lang. She is an associate professor of atmospheric and oceanic sciences at UW-Madison. She is also a leading national expert on how the polar vortex influences our winter weather. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to get to talk winter weather here in Wisconsin.
Well, we always have lots of it, but we don't normally have this polar vortex weather so early. Before we dive into the impact the polar vortex is having on our weather, can you help us understand exactly what a polar vortex is? We hear it, but we may not really understand it.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. The polar vortex, the term the polar vortex, has been a term in atmospheric science and meteorology since the 1950s. But, in recent years, probably the last decade or so, it's really gained a lot of attention in the news. And so the polar vortex, when we think about it, it really isn't just these cold air outbreaks. It's a phenomena that develops every winter. And usually when we talk about it in scientific terms, we're talking about the phenomena that develops in the stratosphere, about 10 miles above us. So this particular thing, it develops every winter, and it develops because as the sun sets and winter days get longer and longer, the high latitudes, the polar regions, really cool rapidly. And as they cool rapidly, we get really cold air that develops, and around that cold air, we get winds. And really strong winds. And so this is the polar vortex, is that combination of the really strong winds that go around the pole and the cold air in the pole. But usually we talk about it about 10 miles above where we all live at Earth's surface.
And so when we take a look at what we're experiencing now, what causes that polar vortex to drop? And so it's not 10 miles above Earth, it's right in our neighborhood.
Yeah, so every now and then, so every winter, this polar vortex develops. It's well above us, and we can think about it as this spinning top, sort of sitting at the North Pole. And if you've ever played with the kids' toy, a spinning top, sometimes they're really good and they sit still, but sometimes it'll get a wobble and it'll go all over the place. And that's exactly what's happening with this polar vortex, is when we have this thing, this polar vortex in the stratosphere, sometimes we get wobbles associated with it. And those wobbles are connected to the weather that we experience. So when we get these wobbles, we're more likely to see that cold air spill out of the Arctic regions into the US or into sometimes Europe or Siberia. It really can happen anywhere across the Northern Hemisphere. And we just happen to be feeling the brunt of it right now. Usually when we get one of these wobbles of cold air spilling out of the Arctic, it generally means that somewhere else in the Northern Hemisphere, warm air is going into the Arctic. So, here we are, we're getting the cold air. Parts of Europe right now are getting the warm air. So we get this exchange of cold air and warm air in and out of the Arctic during these events.
Right now, the prediction is that we're going to be getting this polar vortex for a while. It doesn't look like it's going anywhere. How do we know that the polar vortex, as it's wobbling, is going to stick around here a little bit longer?
That's a really good question. So as the polar vortex develops, it's really big. It's this huge phenomena. It basically is this, big blob. It's like a hat that sits on top of the northern hemisphere. And because it's so big, it's really a stable system. It takes a lot to get these wobbles to, wobble in a certain way. But once you get it off the pole, it kind of stays off the pole. It takes a long time to recover. And because it takes such a long time to recover, as soon as you get one of these wobbles started, we know that the next 2, 3 weeks are going to be these periods of high impact weather, whether that's the cold air that we're experiencing or the warm air that is hitting parts of Europe. But usually, because this phenomena is so large, it also means it has a long sticking time. So we are experiencing the cold air, and this cold air it takes up a lot of space. So it's not just this fleeting little bit of a cold night that we'll have one night, but it's this prolonged period of cold weather that we're experiencing.
How does the polar vortex impact our weather in other ways? We've gotten, it seems, a little more snow than we normally get in early December and in December for the most part. How does this impact snow?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I'm a snow lover, so I'm always looking in the future for, are we getting this set up? So typically, when we get this high impact, this cold air moving south, this warm air moving north, we get what we like to call this high amplitude weather. And really, that's just this waviness in the jet stream that brings us our weather systems. And because we have this contrast in this really cold air and this really warm air, that kind of gives us the ingredients we need to get, low pressure systems and things that organize the snow. So whenever we see, and we're looking at the weather maps and we see a low pressure system and we see cold fronts and warm fronts, these are the things that get organized by the large scale flow. And the large scale flow is this polar vortex variability. So when we're getting these low pressure systems that get organized, those are the things that bring us the snow. And they're moving along as this polar vortex is wobbling. So we're setting ourselves up for a period of this high amplitude flow and a series of low pressure systems that bring us the precipitation and the weather that we typically experience with winter.
It does seem, though, this is all happening a little bit early. When we tend to think of when we have experienced the polar vortex in the past, we tend to think of January, February, not necessarily in December.
Yes, it's very early. So typically when we have these polar vortex, we like to call them disruptions or, these wobbles. These polar vortex events typically happen in January and February. Sometimes they happen in December, but mostly January and February. And so the fact that we had one that got kickstarted in November is extremely rare. I think the last one of this type of amplitude, this huge wobble that we had early in the season, happened in 1968. So a long time ago. We also had recent sort of lesser degree, but still wobbles of the polar vortex in the year 2000. 2019 was another one. And those seasons tended to have a lot of snow in December here in southern Wisconsin.
And quickly, any prediction of what we're going to see then for the rest of winter, January, February? I say March, though people in Wisconsin say March is spring.
That's a good question also. And I think, unfortunately, it's a bit hard to tell. Some of the things, so as meteorologists, if you could make a prediction for a month from now, that would be great. But it's really hard to do that. And what we do is we turn to these large scale things happening in the atmosphere. And the polar vortex variability is one of those. This year also happens to be a La Nina year. So La Nina is the colder ocean surface temperatures in the Pacific, and that can also tend to push our weather in, a more favorable cold, a little bit more favorable snowy conditions for us in Wisconsin. So the polar vortex and its variability and impact on our weather will probably only last for another, few weeks, maybe a week or so through mid-December. But the La Nina conditions will persist through the whole season. So overall, it'll probably be a little bit more snowy, but I can't guarantee that. There's a lot of uncertainty beyond the next 3 weeks.
Well, we can't control it, but thank you so much, Dr. Lopez, for helping us to have a better understanding of our weather in Wisconsin in the winter.
Absolutely. And thanks so much for having me.
Of course. We are right back.